Welcome everyone. We made it right. So we've got our fifth panel. And I've got to just say, unfortunately, one of the presenters hasn't made it yet, but it most likely will not be. That's Mustafa Yunus's paper on Al-Farabius and then on Aristotle's views about the cosmos. But we've got Marwan giving us his presentation. I was really excited when words like Ghazali and theodicy come out. And then he sank my heart, he put inconsistent. So I've got to find out what's going on. So Marwan, I'll hand it over to you, your 20 minutes. So yeah, and then we'll have a Q&A.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for the kind introductions. So Ghazali isn't really my research focus. That's more of the stuff in the back there. But this is something I actually worked on a couple of years ago. But I figured since this conference, the official theme is Ghazali studies, this would fit right in. So, right? So I'm going to take advantage of the fact that the scholar I'm going to speak about is everyone's favorite and needs no introduction. And I'm going to jump right into the topic. In Ghazali studies, the theme of inconsistency has gotten a lot of attention already, in part because of the range of Ghazali's corpus and the fact that he engaged a number of different groups at different places and phases in his career. Readers as early as Ibn Rushd were already complaining that Ghazali is an Ash'ari with the Ash'aris, Sufi with the Sufi, a philosopher with the philosophers. This is a common criticism. The secondary literature sometimes frames this problem in terms of Ghazali's cosmology. Is he an occasionalist, or is he an Abyssinian, or is he a Sufi metaphysician? Is he just one or all of these? You'll usually get one of two conclusions, either that Ghazali is inconsistent, or that he has a single true doctrine, and the apparent conflicts in his thought are just a screen to conceal that true doctrine. My aim in this presentation is not to take a definite stance in this debate, but rather to see what happens if we approach the question from a very specific angle, the angle of his theodicy rather than his cosmology. By theodicy, just to be clear with my terms, I mean the way that Ghazali tackles what's commonly known as the problem of evil, more poetically, the endeavor to reconcile the reality of suffering and or evil with the mercy and justice of an omnipotent creator. Theodicy can be treated as a logical problem, as in how are these beliefs compatible logically, or as a spiritual problem, as in how do I approach God in light of this reality? And Ghazali engages it in both ways. Now, just a disclaimer, in the interest of time, I'm going to zoom in on just one very specific aspect of Ghazali's theodicy, that is his conception of divine justice, as understood from God's name Al-Adl, the just. By limiting our scope, my hope is that we'll have a manageable frame where we can consider the consistency problem. But just keep in mind that there's a lot more to be said about Ghazali's theodicy, including his discussions of divine mercy, rahmah, generosity, jud, and so on. A very little bit of background. Most Ash'ari discussions of justice or adl have to be understood as responses to the Mu'tazili conception of divine justice. So the Mu'tazilis foregrounded divine justice in their theology. They're known as they call themselves Ahl al-Adl wa Tawheed. Ultimately, divine justice for them means that God does not commit acts that are blameworthy. They use the Arabic term qabih, which literally means ugly or repugnant, but in its technical moral usage here, it's defined as whatever deserves blame. So God does not commit such acts because he's just. The important point is that the Mu'tazilis held that what is blameworthy is so independently of God's agency. He's making it so. It's blameworthy because of what it is. In other words, there's an objective moral order, or there are objectively valid moral standards that logically they precede God's acts. For God to be just, his acts must conform to these standards. So now, while this might be like the common sense way we think about moral agency in general, the Ash'aris strongly rejected this account of justice as applied to God. For the Ash'aris, there can be no moral standards that preside over God's will and creative activity. So the Ash'aris defined qubh, or blameworthiness, differently in order to account for God's justice. For Imam al-Ash'ari, an act is blameworthy when it transgresses the legislative will of someone who is a sovereign over the agent. I think that's the definition he gives in the Lumma. Because God is not under anyone's sovereignty, none of God's acts can even hypothetically be blameworthy. This means that God is just no matter what he does. God is just by definition. Ghazali endorses this Ash'ari conception of God's justice in quite a number of places in his works. The way I'm going to do this, rather than just summarizing what Ghazali says, I'm going to provide passages that we can look at and process together. In the interest of time and slide space, I've translated the passages into English. I just have the English up there. Here's one statement from Kitab Qawa'id al-Aqa'id, the book on the principles of the creed, the second book in his monumental Ihya Ulumuddin, starting from the middle in this passage. But it is inconceivable that God could act unjustly, since no one else has a dominion such that he, God, could be unjust in disposing freely of it. That's a tasarruf, that I translated disposing freely. Ghazali continues, he could have loosed upon his servants all types of suffering and afflicted them with all varieties of pain and hardship. Had he done so, it would still have been just, adil, on his part, and not bad, qabih, or unjust, dhulm. What Ghazali is saying is that it's conceptually impossible for an act of God to be unjust because his acts pertain to his creation, which is his dominion. There's a conceptual prerequisite to injustice. To be unjust, one has to be transgressing, so to speak, in a dominion that's not one's own. But God owns everything absolutely. Therefore, it's impossible for God to be unjust. And you see this with the counterfactual scenario that Ghazali gives. God could have conceivably made this world hell and pure suffering. This would have still been just of him because he has the right to do whatever he wills with his creation. Here's another passage from Ghazali in Fada'ih al-Batiniyah. God can torment all his creatures and forcibly cast them into the hellfire, for he would thereby be administering his dominion in accordance with his will. There is no objection from the vantage of reason to a sovereign's agency. What is unjust is to place a thing where it does not belong or to dispense freely with that to which the agent has no claim. This is inconceivable with respect to God. The point, again, is that injustice is simply inapplicable to God, no matter how he decides to govern his creation. This is because creation is his dominion, and he has the right to do anything with his dominion. But even more importantly, we get the idea that this is a question of sovereignty, the way that justice is being defined. When reason objects to an agent's acts, it appeals to some moral order that has authority over the agent. But since God is the ultimate sovereign, there can be no standard by which to evaluate his acts. Reason simply can't establish any constraint on God. Nothing and no one can establish a moral standard that would apply to God's acts. One last passage in the same vein, though technically uses the word good, hasan, instead of just. But I just wanted to include this one to emphasize the point that for Ghazali, no hypothetical act we might conceive from God could possibly be blameworthy. He says, and this is the Iqtisad fil I'tiqad, an act of God is good, whatever it be, which means that he has no responsibility or blame on its account, and that he acts in his dominion, which is not shared with others. What follows logically, if you try to imagine the most evil, most bad, unjust state of affairs, and suppose that God had actualized it, it would still be the case, strictly speaking, from the technical usage of the term adl that's being used here, that the act is good. It's not unjust. It's just because conceptually, any act from the absolute sovereign is just. If we wanted to capture the main point in a statement, we could say that there is no relationship of entailment between God's justice in this sense and any particular act within God's power. No acts of God are more or less just than others. At this point, I know this is repetition, but it's important, and I'm dwelling on this because of what we're going to see now. In his commentary on the divine name Al-Adl, the just, in his work on the divine names, Al-Maqsad al-Asna fi Sharh Asma'illahi al-Husna, Ghazali seems to undermine this idea of divine justice, just being true by definition. Rather than pointing to God's absolute sovereignty, to say that God is necessarily just, Ghazali points to God's acts. One who does not know God's acts, he states, does not know his justice. He goes on to explain that the meaning of divine justice can only be understood by contemplating his acts. Quoting the Quranic verse, you will not see any shortcoming in the creation of the merciful. Look again, can you see any shortcoming? From Surah Al-Mulk. Ghazali says that the justice of God is to be perceived in the same way that the cosmos is ordered. God's creation is arranged in the most suitable manner. Earth, water, air, the heavens, and the planets are all in their proper places. Not only that, but the cosmic order would have collapsed if this arrangement were reversed. He says, لو ركز هذا الترتيب لبطل النظام. Another example Ghazali gives of the way that God's creation indicates his justice is the example of the human body. It's made of bones, which are the internal frame, flesh, which cushions the skeleton, skin, which protects the flesh. Once again, he says, if this arrangement were reversed, that would entail a collapse of the proper order of things. Don't try to imagine it. The placement of each organ in its proper place in the body indicates God's justice. If the eye were in the back, on the leg, on the hand, or on top of the head, again, don't imagine it, this would have been a deficient way of arranging the body. If the hand were attached to the knee, this would have prevented it from serving its function. Ghazali provides these examples as some of the more obvious indications of God's justice. So the human body, the cosmos in its general ordering. Ultimately, though, he argues that all of creation displays a perfection that is evidence of God's justice. Now, this all sounds very plausible on its own to a believer, but compared next to the claims we were just considering earlier, I think we're starting to see a bit of a conflict. By claiming that God is just because of the way that he arranged the creation, Ghazali seems to be undermining the claim that the particularity of God's acts has no logical connection with his justice. This looks quite problematic, because if we have to consider what the act is in order to determine that it is just, then by implication it is not the case that all hypothetical acts of God are necessarily equally consistent with his justice. Yet Ghazali's claim now is precisely that the determinate features of God's act that he chose to manifest in creation are the only true proof of his justice. It is because his acts are the way that they are, rather than another way, that indicate his justice. To illustrate the conflict, take Ghazali's claim that the parts of the human body are all respectively situated in their proper places. If this claim is understood to mean that the parts of the body had proper places prior to and independently of the divine placement, then this is in conflict with Ghazali's Ash'ari view that nothing is evaluable prior to the divine act. Nothing is intrinsically proper or right. Such an interpretation of Ghazali's statement would undermine his Ash'ari meta-ethics. Interestingly, Ghazali himself volunteers this very interpretation. He says, you must know, is this here on the slide? You must know that he did not create anything in a place without its being designated, muta'ayyan, for that place. Had created things been further left, right, beneath or higher, it would have been deficient, naqis, vain, batil, bad, qabih, or inappropriate, kharij an mutanasib. Ghazali's meaning here is unmistakable. To actualize certain alternative possibilities in creation would have been unjust, part of God. All that God does, to continue the quote, is just, adl, and is what ought to be, in the manner that it ought to be. Had God not done what he has done, another outcome of greater harm, darar, would have occurred, he says. In the same way, if a sick person were not to undergo cupping, he would undergo harm that exceeds the pain of cupping. It is by this that God is just. بِهَذَا يَكُونُ اللَّهُ تَعَالَى عَدْلًا. God's acts are just because of their outcomes. This is an as explicit a statement as one could ask for. And this type of claim is no anomaly in Ghazali's corpus. In his Kitab al-Tawheed wa Tawakkul in the Ihya, Ghazali again invokes God's justice when explaining what one must believe in order to attain a high degree of trust in God. Skipping to the second paragraph on the slide, nor is there in possibility anything whatever that is better than it, meaning the way that God created the world, nor more complete, nor more perfect. Had there been such impossibility, and had he withheld it despite having the ability to create it, and had he not graciously brought it about, then that would have been stinginess, inconsistent with generosity, and injustice, dhulm, inconsistent with justice. There are a number of things we could note about this passage, but suffice it to point out that the claim that withholding a better, more complete, or more perfect world would be unjust on the part of God is an explicit statement that certain hypothetical acts would have entailed injustice. Both the content and the spirit of this passage seem to be in total contradiction with his passages on divine sovereignty and the unfettered moral prerogative of God. One last passage to drive the point home, also from the Ihya. Just as the ransom of human souls by animal souls and granting humans the authority to slaughter animals is not injustice, rather granting priority to the perfect humans over the imperfect animals is justice itself, ayn al-adl. So too is the magnification of the blessing given to the dwellers of paradise by amplifying the torment of those in the hellfire, and the ransom of the faithful by the unfaithful, justice itself. All of these concrete examples of God's justice in creation, complemented with reasons why alternative possibilities are deficient, are clear implications that the justice of God has determinate implications for his agency in creation for Ghazali. So that's as much of the setup of the consistency problem as I thought we could afford in the time we have. I hope I've convinced you that, at least at face value, there is a strong case to be made for the conclusion that there are two inconsistent ideas of divine justice in Ghazali's thought. Now, ideally, we would spend time discussing why each of these two conceptions of divine justice is important for Ghazali and what role it plays in his larger intellectual vision. I do believe that both are very important for him, and neither could easily be given up. But in the interest of time, I'll just leave it at that, noting that each of the two conceptions of divine justice is fundamentally tied to an aspect of Ghazali's larger intellectual project. How would one go about reconciling the apparent inconsistency? First, I think we should immediately rule out the idea that Ghazali simply changed his view, that he conceptualized divine justice in one way at one point in his life, and then he conceptualized it a different way later. The reason I think we need to rule this out is that we have both views presented together in full force and maturity in the Ihya Ulumuddin. In the secondary literature in English, the only extended study of Ghazali's theodicy is a book published in 1984 by Eric Ormsby titled Theology in Islamic Thought, which traces historical debates among Muslim scholars regarding some of the passages we just saw. But the focus in these debates was about whether it was acceptable to say that the actual present order of creation is necessary, a claim that we saw Ghazali make. Ormsby concludes that the commentators were able to explain the necessity in relation to God's knowledge, will, and wisdom. Divine wisdom, he says, is the ultimate justification for the cosmic order and the final refuge of necessity in Ghazali's theodicy and Ash'ari theology as a whole. I find that the focus on necessity misses the real tension in Ghazali's competing conceptions of divine justice, which is really all about whether predicating divine justice of God restricts the range of acts that can consistently be attributed to God. Would God be just if he placed the human eye on the knee? In some places he says yes. In others he says that this would not, that this would be injustice. To give Ormsby credit, he does excellent historical work excavating all the voices who wrote on Ghazali's theodicy. One of these voices, interestingly, is Ahmad ibn Mubarak Sijil-Masi, who died in 1742, the Common Era, and appears to have succinctly posed the problem in the way that I've done today. Ormsby notes briefly that Sijil-Masi was left virtually unanswered. I think that based on the foregoing analysis, if a reconciling interpretation can be achieved, it would have to defend the claim that Ghazali is dealing with the term justice as a homonym. I see no other path to a tenable reconciliation. I'll conclude by trying to give some shape to such a solution, but I don't claim to have anything airtight. Needless to say, I also don't claim to be representing Ghazali himself. It's just that I'm not quite ready to simply dismiss what Ghazali's given us as inconsistent, because I do think both of these conceptions of divine justice represent a perspective on theodicy that plays an important role in the believer's spiritual and theological outlook. I suggest then that a successful solution would have to lie in the linguistic aspect of the divine names. Insofar as they are linguistic entities, the divine names are subject to the imposition wada' of a word onto a meaning. By discussing the name the just, al-adl, in two different contexts, one could argue, Ghazali ends up dealing with the concept of justice with two different relations of linguistic imposition. In plainer language, Ghazali gives us two different conceptions of divine justice because he is dealing with two different concepts that share a name. This is what we call a pair of homonyms. On the one hand, we have justice as a technical term that emerges from a historical dialectic of Ash'arism with Mu'tazili theology and meta-ethics. The Mu'tazilis defended a technical conception of justice that limited the agency of God, as we saw, because it presupposed an independent moral principle with jurisdiction over the divine will. The Ash'aris responded, as is well known, with a meta-ethical view on which there is no ontological reality to moral determinations in the experimental world. When an act is characterized as just or good or right in the technical jargon of the Ash'aris, that is not because it possesses that moral quality as a concrete attribute. Instead, it only possesses any moral quality in the sense that the quality describes the act's relation to conventional values or human interests. Therefore, when Ghazali as an Ash'ari says that God is just, we have seen that he's only applying the term with reference to a conventional sense, specifically with reference to the conventional domain of the convention of domain. and property and sovereignty. The appeal to this redefined usage of the technical term justice is meant to follow from the position that the term as defined by the Mu'tazilis has no referent. It's not, it doesn't, that their view is incorrect and that there is no such justice as they call it. But on the other hand, we have justice as the concept is ordinarily understood. And in ordinary usage, justice implies that an agent acts in a certain way. What would ordinarily characterize as just, for example, is an agent's putting of things in an arrangement that makes sense and appeals to our minds as suitable and orderly. If we grant that Ghazali is using the term justice as imposed on this meaning by the convention of ordinary usage, then we might be in a position to say that Ghazali is just using the term in two different senses, and that's what creates the apparent inconsistency. According to the solution, if God placed the eye on the knee, that would be just in the sense that he can do as he pleases in his dominion. This is justice A. But it would be unjust in the sense that it is unsuitable, justice B. So both at the same time, just in one sense and unjust in the other sense. Is this a satisfactory solution? Well, a Mu'tazili might respond that it is unjust of Ghazali not to recognize that justice in the justice in the second sense is simply what the Mu'tazilis have been affirming all along. I'll leave you to judge. Thank you.